Jon Baskin, you're here. You're talking to me on this podcast, this video podcast, whatever you want to call it, in the year of the Adult Depend Undergarment 2026.
You
Um, the 30th
really could see
anniversary.
Trump doing something like that, right?
John, I really could. Man, I could, and and maybe it would be one of, maybe it would be a laudable policy. Maybe it would be a heel turn for him. Um, but yeah, seriously, I'm so excited to be talking about Infinite Jest in 30 years later after this book was published, talking with you, founding editor of The Point about it, talking about your book Ordinary Unhappiness. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me on. I've really enjoyed working with you and your amazing point essay, and also following your Substack, and so I'm happy to be here.
Thank you, John. And there may be some viewers who don't fit in that kind of Venn diagram overlap of both of our work here. So if you're just meeting John right now, there's some things you got to know about him. Um, like I said, he's a founding editor of The Point, which is a fabulous magazine that we were just talking before I started recording here about how The Point is really embracing inquiry that is not hyper politicized or identitarian or dogmatic, and being now post vibe shift rewarded for it, I think, with a lot more just like public profile and readers. It's really great to see. So please read The Point if you haven't. Subscribe. John is also the director of the program for public thinking at the University of Chicago. He's a professor in the cultural reporting and criticism program at NYU. He holds a doctor of philosophy from the University of Chicago's Committee on Social Thought, and his essays and criticism have appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Review of Books, The Chronicle of Higher Education, and The Nation, among other publications. His book, which you all just saw here, Ordinary Unhappiness, The Therapeutic Fiction of David Foster Wallace, was published by Stanford University Press in 2010. And right here, James Wood, John, I love this. James Wood was like, it's a good book. Even if you disagree with it, I would give it to my students. And I was like, that is a needle moving blurb, I think, from someone who would be, sorry, James Wood, I know you watch my podcast religiously, who would be disinclined towards overt florid praise. So, John, this book is very praiseworthy.
He has
I
admitted to me he does not stand by every judgment from that hyper. Wait, what was it called? What did he call Wallace? Hyper realism essay, the
the hyper
criticizing
real
Wallace. Yeah.
real. That's no, it's and totally like James Wood is allowed to like shift and be fluid, and maybe James Wood needs to write an adult braces and go on talking about the discourse. But yeah, I think it's really great to basically see that you've got a really like kind of like a sharp group of folks who might not always agree with what you're saying in here, weighing in on the power of this book, John. It's really fun to read. I'll give a little bit of a some context for this book, and then I would love to have you read just a short excerpt from it, if that's okay.
Sure.
So, John, from what I understand, this is kind of the culmination of like your scholarly work for your PhD. Yeah.
Yeah, it was
Um,
basically adapted from my dissertation.
okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Um, and this is, I think, if we're talking about the vibe shift, right? I think this is a pretty important book because this book makes a compelling case, and I think an illuminating case for not the Wallace bro, which has become unfortunately metonymic with the concept of David Foster Wallace and his fiction. We'll get to that later. But for the fiction of David Foster Wallace, why did people care about this so much? Why was it so exciting? What's the deal? Why do we care? Why did we care so deeply and so intensely and so fervidly? Why did it feel like an oniric wind blowing through our lives? I think this is an exciting read because you, like the magazine you founded, have you've held the line on why this is like identity aside, you know, subject matter, broadly speaking, aside, why this guy's fiction mattered and why it mattered to you. And I responded to this book really intensely because it mattered to me in the same way. And I was a woman the whole time.
Amazing.
Through every single, I know. I had a pretty Talmudic investment in the fiction of David Foster Wallace, and it was because of the therapeutic features that you name, especially in Infinite Jest, that I was really attracted to it. So I'm excited to talk a bit more about this book, why, and your personal response to reading Wallace and what prompted you to write it. But let's before
Yeah.
we even get into that, if you could read that short excerpt,
Okay.
I'd love to hear it.
Which excerpt?
If you could even start, John, from like the very big, like that your introduction, right? And like basically why the introduction about the habits of mind.
So
You would
just the very
only
beginning?
Yeah, just the very beginning. Yeah. And like just a few paragraphs in there. We could keep it shorter than 5 minutes just to give us a
Yeah.
taste. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, okay. The very first philosophical challenge to the arts remains the most daunting. Considering the role of art in their ideal city, and his interlocutors in Plato's Republic settle on two options: censorship or exile. Poets and painters can either abide by the quote models philosophers have established for educating good citizens, limiting themselves to hymns to the gods of the city and the like, or they can take their leave. The argument against artists unfolds in two stages. In books two and three, Socrates deals with art predominantly in terms of the kind of activity it promotes, for example, deception and imitation. And when he returns to it in book 10, he begins by summarizing and adding to his earlier account of the inherent dangers of poetic imagery. But later in the same book, he clarifies that his argument against artists or image makers does not rest primarily on a suspicion of their tools. Philosophers, as Socrates himself has demonstrated in the allegory of the cave, also use poetic imagery. What distinguishes the image maker is that she does not know what the images she uses are for. When Socrates says that poets are imitators in the highest possible degree, he means not that they are the most skilled at making images, but rather that, absent any higher criteria of value, their use of images can answer only to the low logic of the marketplace, that is, to what is popular or pleasing to their audience. That is why those, quote, praisers of Homer who say that this poet educated Greece are mistaken. Homer could not have educated Greece because Homer's poetry prioritizes pleasure and pain over that argument which in each instance is best in the opinion of the community. More?
That was perfect. I think, thank you so much, John. And that's actually a really great entree to talk about the first question I have here. Um, because, you know, this book, as I've said, makes a compelling case for the fiction of David Foster Wallace as therapeutic, philosophically, dialectically
Yeah.
therapeutic. Um, and that what you just read, I think, applies to a lot to the case you make and how you make it. I'm wondering though, if we could kind of like flash back to your your PhD and maybe your first encounters with the fiction of David Foster Wallace. What what was going on for you then? How did you respond to Wallace when you first read him? How did he come to matter to you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I read it the first time I read Infinite Jest was in college.
Hmm.
I was at Brown. This was in 2001 or two, I believe. I think 2001 because I think it was not the year of 9/11. I sort of remember. And I'd had various people sort of tell me about the book and recommend it. The truth is, I didn't read much contemporary fiction. You grow up through high school and college. I was an English major, but you actually mostly you're reading older books and you have sometimes only a dim awareness of what's really going on around you in contemporary fiction. So it was rare for me to read something that was a contemporary book. Um, I remember reading Jonathan Franzen's essay in the New York Review of Books, which was actually about the genesis of the corrections, but him talking about how Infinite Jest had like woken him from his dogmatic slumber and he needed to go and read it, or he needed to write something that could compete with what it had done. And that was one of the things I think that got me off my own butt to read it. So the first time I read the book, I mean, it's very interesting, I think, in relation to what I argue in my book, that the two different focuses I had the two times I read it. So the first time I read it, I was like 21. I loved the tennis sections. I thought Helen Candenza was this tragic, romantic figure. He was brilliant and clever, but unhappy, which is just like how I thought of myself. And, I at the time wanted to be a fiction writer. I considered myself a tortured, alienated soul, and I found that Hal and the kids at the tennis academy were really what I was focused on. I thought they were very cool. And and the AA sections, I kind of skimmed. Like, I just thought they
Mhm.
were kind of boring. Like, funny sometimes, but not really. The Gately character never felt nearly as sort of important to me personally when I was reading the book. The one other thing I'll say about the first time I read it, though, that really hit home with me is I was at Brown in English literary studies, and I was really bathed in like postmodern theory. That was what we learned there, much to my chagrin, as I've written about since. I had a very bad experience in the Brown English department. But nevertheless, Infinite Jest sort of was a book that made me interested in postmodern ideas in a way
Mm.
that really I hadn't been through my education. Because I think Wallace, he was so good at sort of showing you the human stakes of these theories and of how they really informed the way that particularly the kids in the tennis academy saw and understood their own world. And it made the ideas more interesting to me, even though as I would later come to see Wallace as very much a critic of many of those ideas. He brought home their sort of human implications in a way that I had struggled to see from the ways they'd been sort of presented to me by my professors. So I read the novel. I liked it a lot. I read some other Wallace stuff. In grad school, I went to this program called the Committee on Social Thought, which is a sort of idiosyncratic grad program at U Chicago where you read sort of books in many different disciplines, history, philosophy, sociology, uh, religious, theology, very slowly and with not a lot of secondary sourcing. It's some people call it interdisciplinary, although one of my professors like to call it undisciplined, which I think is a
Mhm.
better way to describe it. And there were a lot of people there who were interested in the relationship between philosophy and literature, and I
Mm.
was one of them. And I early on, Plato's Republic is like the Bible in this program. You read, I mean, actually, you read the Bible too, but you read Plato's Republic is like one of the first things I read there. And Plato banishes the poets, as I was just writing, and I felt that his reasons for banishing them were quite convincing, actually.
Mm.
And I felt from a philosophical or political perspective, what really good are these artists? They're wielding these very powerful tools of being able
Mm.
to wield images and educate and have influence on children and influence on everybody on their desires
Mm.
and drives, and yet they have not necessarily figured out what the good is. So
Mm.
they're very dangerous, and even for those of us who value art, we have to think it could be a force for good. We have to really reckon with why Plato is saying, like, no, they're not good. They're not good for your
Mm.
soul, and they're not good for the city, for the
Mm.
political community. And so when I came back to Wallace in grad school, I was really interested in reading him and reading through him about this question of the relationship between philosophy and literature. Socrates at the end of book 10 or toward the end in the second section about literature says something like, I love literature and I don't want to banish it. So I would love for someone to offer me an apology that could show me why the poets and the writers should be let back into the city. And so I wondered, would Wallace get into the city? And as I was reading, as I was rereading it, that question was on my mind and thinking
Mm.
about what is Wallace really doing philosophically in this book.
Mm.
People have talked a lot about it being philosophical in various ways, but I was really had that on my mind. And furthermore, I was 27 the second time I read it, and it was just very interesting to me. And this is connected with what I think he was doing philosophically. It was very interesting to me how the second time I read it, the sort of callowness and emptiness of Hal and his friends was so much more apparent to me than it had been the first time. Whereas Gately and the AA portions suddenly were incredibly interesting to me and
Yeah.
and felt like they were addressing uh, problems of adulthood in a way and of coming to maturity in a way that makes sense. I completely missed when I was 21.
Mm,
Um, so I'll
totally.
stop there, but that's, yeah.
Yeah, no, it really has me thinking of how, we come into the world howling Cadenza and we leave Don Gately, refusing Demerol and I just, John, the case you make for Wallace, which is basically this is fiction that's going to help you get out of that kind of Cartesian state of distance, that sort of like very propositional relationship with the external world, and into a more uh you know I don't know, like into a more like narrative, literary, communal, conversational experience with the world around you. I think it's something that certainly can be said of, at the very least, of Jest, but I think it's also to me, you're expressing in your book, you're expressing something that a lot of us, and I'm getting into micro generations of millennials, I know, but have felt. Um, Being exposed to a lot of postmodernism and invigorated by it, right? Like, oh my God, who's not going to be excited by the second sex? Show me some. Like who's not going to be like, whoa, here's Judith Butler, right? Here's Franz Fanon. Here's all this. Here, essentially, these kinds of like deconstructions of power that
Yeah.
are intoxicating, right? Because like, where is the power? Where is the kind of that to use kind of a Wallacean term, right? Like, where is the abyss? Like, where is like the source of the addiction, the televisual kind, like the thing that's sapping our energy and keeping us watching, right? And I saw like Allen Ginsberg was writing about it in Howl. The first line talks about it. We were all dealing with the fact that like we were feeling addicted, we were feeling coerced, we were feeling afraid, we were looking at, different representations, right? Of I'm homing in on the millennial middle class here, but different representations of family life, of
Hmm.
professional life that felt stifling. And then we are looking at the baby boomers and being like, you broke out of your own kind of strictures only to reintroduce a
Yeah.
new set of strictures. Yeah. So, like, of course, you come to college and you're like, whoa, critique of power. And, and I think that what I love that you do in your book and that you show us, like, show us that, like, Wallace is doing, or at least trying to do. I love honest accounts of how, like, you can, now using an AA quote here, take what you need and leave the rest. You can
Yeah.
critique power, but you needn't critique power unto the point of like this, just like vapidity or dogma.
Yeah.
There is an
Well,
addiction
also,
in it.
let me just
Yeah,
point out one thing about the way you presented that progression of, we feel stifled by whatever, let's call it bourgeois society as that we
sure.
grow up. We come to college and it gives us these tools. There's something, I mean, part of the invigorating thing, especially, and this is just like for an 18 or 19-year-old, is the postmodern tools give you a sense that you're sort of in on a secret, right? You're one of the
Mm-hmm.
elect. You
Yes,
know.
yes, yes,
Theory, I mean, theory is very well suited for this kind of sensibility. And one of
yes,
the
it
terms I
is.
use in my book a lot is the question of sort of Wallace is taking you on a journey from theory to therapy, or therapy.
Mm,
He's using therapy, not theory, and therapy to show the limits of theory to some degree.
yes.
That the philosophical therapy is partly about the limits of theory. But one other point that I think is really distinctive about Wallace, and I actually remember thinking the movie actually captured this well because it's not
Mm,
always something people recognize. But so theory gives you a secret. It gives you a sort of set of tools with which to analyze and criticize the world from which you've come from, and it separates you from that world. And the world
yeah.
that you've come from becomes the world of convention and common sense, and all of that is corrupt from this
Mm-hmm.
perspective. And
Mm-hmm.
one of the things that I think is so powerful, or was for me anyway, about the AA portions of Infinite Jest is Wallace, for a sort of an assumed reader who has taken that position, re-enchants common sense. He
Totally.
sort of
Yeah.
shows you and not only re-enchants it, but shows that there are powerful lessons for precisely the kind of pain and alienation that many of the kind of people who maybe were attracted to his books and live in this intellectual mindset have in many of the dictates of AA, which you might be tempted to look at and say, those aren't for me. Those are for, these bourgeois, or like worse even, completely unsophisticated.
These are sheep, the people who follow.
Yeah,
Yeah,
sheep.
totally.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And I think one of the things he's trying to deconstruct in a way is that distinction between like having theoretical knowledge, but also being able to appreciate that there's real sense and common sense.
Yes.
And like
Yes.
it's not all just
Absolutely.
benighted people running around and you know better than all of them?
Totally. And this applies whether we're talking about the show, right, which could be professional tennis, but let's be real, it can also be these like highly rarefied spaces that we're running around in and quoting theory to each
Right.
other in, like academia, like whatever, the literary world, you name it. It could be the family structure, right? And I think, it could be you can just name any kind of like the polis, right? Any kind of social structure where you are compromised by your own thinking.
Right.
This appeal to common sense is feels it became very urgent for me. That is why I responded to Wallace. I
Yeah.
wasn't sitting there, and I think we'll get into the gender stuff too, because it's where it's needs to be mentioned, I think. But I wasn't. What was so moving to me was not that a man could say this and that the solution could be like, insert hypermasculine stereotype XYZ, right? Or like what was exciting to me was that anyone was saying this. And I found Wallace to be a part of a constellation of people saying stuff like this across time. Not just localized within like the kind of like, dude heavy new sincerity category, though I have many writers I enjoy from that group. But across time and place, I think that Wallace belongs to this appeal to kind of the common sense. Let's not have your body be be delimited by your thought alone. Let's actually like talk about where's the body, what's it doing in space, which ended up
Yeah.
being a very kind of feminist read of things. But John, I want to go back for a second too to the flawed Cartesianism of it all, because you say in your book that the Wallace's therapeutic fiction is basically, I'm paraphrasing a bit here, but it's helping the reader understand that her best thinking is not necessarily her happiest thinking,
Uh-huh.
right? And the I think therefore I am is not the dictum that we
Right.
should necessarily
Right.
follow. Maybe the dictum looks something more like, hey, I'm powerless before all the thinking I'm doing, I give it up, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And I'm wondering, you bring in a lot of different philosophers, but I'll home in on Wittgenstein because we are talking about David Foster Wallace, and Wittgenstein did have some like famous rebuttals to that Cartesian dictum. I'm
Yeah.
wondering if you could bring in the Wittgenstein here and talk a little bit about how his rebuttals might apply to the AA in Infinite Jest or other readings of Wallace.
Yeah, so I mean the line that what you just quoted, I mean it's taken from one of the AA dictums, which is my best thinking got me here, which is of
Hmm.
course hilarious. I mean
Yes.
this is also I really appreciated the humor of the AA section when the second time I read it. And I mean so you're sitting there and he draws it for you like you're sitting in this session and you have a character or at least you as the reader are thinking about as I said, it's like his sort of I think his sort of the modal reader that comes to Wallace thinks they're too smart for AA, and or that AA wouldn't be
Uh,
something that would appeal to them. And
yeah.
so I always think about that quote. Well, my best thing, but of course, very smart people get addicted all the time and end up in AA
Right.
or worse. And there are
Yes.
characters that sort of represent that sensibility in the book. And
Yeah.
so, you have like this idea, my best thinking got me here. And what that tells you is your best thinking, in quotes, whatever you think that is, may not be the thing to get you out of here. And it may not be a case that what you need is a better theory to get you out of here
Yeah.
and to get you to a different place. So, so what does that mean? I mean, one thing you might think it means is that he's sort of against thinking, and that he
Mm,
wants you to just feel,
mm,
or be or think aesthetically instead of philosophically, or be I don't know what the other think with your body or whatever, not think. And
sure.
part of what I'm trying to say, and there are artists obviously who do sort of advance that opposition between thinking and a more artistic way of being in the world or something. I don't
Hmm.
think that's what Wallace is doing. And where the Wittgenstein comes in handy for me is that, and obviously Wittgenstein is someone Wallace read a lot, and I'm not the first person to claim that he draws from him, although my book makes a fairly large claim about the extent to which Wallace's stories are, like, in a deep sense, a continuation of Wittgenstein's philosophy. And Wittgenstein's philosophy was very much, God, it's hard to summarize it in any succinct way, but Wittgenstein was very, he was concerned to show that the Cartesian form of thinking was not the only form of thinking, and that you still there's a broad set of ways of thinking and forms of life in which thinking plays a part, only one of which is the philosophical form of life that Descartes was working in and sort of limited by in some sense. And so so the quote, maybe I'll just read it really quickly because I
Yeah.
think the quote that was really important to me from Wittgenstein that I had a sort of aha moment about, oh, this is what Wallace is doing in his fiction. Um, is a line from the Philosophical Investigations where he says, "The real discovery is the one that makes me capable of stopping doing philosophy when I want to, the one that gives philosophy peace, so that it
Hmm.
is no longer tormented by questions which bring itself into question.
Hmm.
Instead, we now demonstrate a method by examples, and the series of examples can be broken off. Problems are solved, difficulties eliminated, not a single problem. There is not a philosophical method, though there are indeed methods like different therapies." So I think that my dissertation was actually called Different Therapies.
Mm,
And the idea was that Wallace's books and short stories were in a way targeted like Wittgenstein's sort of language games that he wrote himself in a way, quite a literary way, Wittgenstein. Um, they were targeted to help his readers understand the limitations of their own ways of thinking, and to sort of come to an understanding that this thing, and often that meant their best thinking, quote unquote, the very things that they thought were the most sophisticated, like you were saying, I've now got this theory, I know how everything works, were in some sense had become prison bars for them, he
mm,
felt. And his sort of guiding question was, why is it that so many, he talked about this sense of lostness he felt among his friends and contemporaries, a real kind of gut level sadness, a sense that they didn't know how to be happy and how to sort of live fulfilled, satisfying lives. And these were very smart people, people that had a lot of education, had a lot of theory, had a lot of time thinking about what the best life would be, or what the world, how to understand the world. And he was really concerned with what was going wrong there. And what he realized was it wasn't just that they had the wrong theory, but that their sort of theory about theory was wrong. They were entrapped in an idea that the right theory was the thing that you needed to live the right kind of life. But in fact, there were all kinds of decisions in life that you could never settle through theory. And I should just say something. I mean, theory is understood here. There's obviously a more acute postmodern version of it. When we talk about critical theory, postmodern theory, something very specific comes up. But it does go back to Descartes for him, because it goes back to the whole modern period as a period where you have this sort of idea of philosophy as this, like, very, as logic, basically, as
yes.
and the mind becomes the thing that makes us human. Our ability to reason and logic ourselves to wherever we need to go becomes the thing we most value. And so for him, in that sense, the postmodern phase of theory was only the sort of acute phase of something that had begun much earlier, which is why someone like Wittgenstein in the 1920s is already concerned with this. Heidegger was concerned with it. There are Nietzsche, there are various modern philosophers that have seen sort of that saw where this was going and were concerned with it from the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we are to some extent in this most acute phase of like I'll call it what is like sort of like theoretical or philosophical distance from the world, whatever however you want to describe that. Now I'm sounding Heideggerian, I know. But we're all kind of contending with the fallout, certain aspects of the, fallout from the Enlightenment.
Yeah,
We're kind of contending from that, or kind of, excuse me, contending with, and maybe in some sense recovering from the propositional logic as our main mode of representation or formulation of the world. And I think that
right.
when you're getting that, and then you're getting, people don't really think about how, even I think in academic circles, people are like, oh, the Enlightenment. So the church just faded away. Yeah, obviously, unless it's your specialty, you know what I mean? But the propositional logic and Christianity, or rather, the social forces, and I think like psychological tendencies that make up millenarian Christianity, and virtue ethics, and
Right.
understanding what, like, consequentially, we could kind of dig deep in there, but like those, when you combine those things, it can be a difficult time. And I'm sure you and I could go on for a while about like how Hegel sanitized Christian, secularized sort of Christianity with the Geist of history, and then you have
Mhm.
Marx who like made it hyper material. But we don't have to get into all those details necessarily. I can just actually hold up this memoir I was holding up again, because I mean, I keep holding up Lindy West's memoir, but John, it feels so relevant because the sort of swirling discourse, and the reason I'm reading this isn't just because obviously I'm familiar with the author and enjoyed her work in the 2010s, but it's because the reason a lot of women are talking about this right now is because West seems to be retconning her feelings about her experience in her marriage and her husband wanting to be polyamorous to fit a set of beliefs, a
Mhm.
stance, which to me, feels like she has a kind of a virtue ethics of how things should work. She has a
Yeah,
sense of like, this is what the good is, and she needs to like retrofit all that. And so, it's funny, right? It's like this feels like a very different audience than, of course, the Wallace audience, right? If we were to be very surface level and talk about who is
Mhm.
reading this. But to me, it's not, because David Foster Wallace and to your point, was trying to spark the same kind of conversation that the discoursing about West, and in some cases even West herself in the book, is trying to spark, which is like,
Yeah.
should we really be trying to make our lives fit a kind of like a, a dogma, a set of beliefs? Like, is this really the
Yeah.
best way to live?
Well, and
And
also,
yeah,
can we reason ourselves to that set of beliefs?
and
I mean, that's the part
exactly.
that I think is, I mean, Wallace was a very moral writer, more than most contemporary writers. I think like he was very concerned with the moral life.
Yeah.
Um, but I think the way in which it's interesting what you just said. So if I understood it right, in a way, you're saying there's a way in which for a lot of people, the logic part and the virtue ethics part gets kind of conflated, where they're kind of like they actually do have a very moralized like ethos, but they explain it to themselves as if it's logical, or that's how I heard it
I'm saying
potentially.
that people are getting very, almost like Kantian, almost like if I dig deep enough, I will know
I
exactly
will
what
find, yeah.
the ethics is. Yeah,
But in
exactly.
fact, they're actually often guided by uh, something that might be emotional or not fully thought through,
Right.
as they're
And it
doing that.
might, I would only add, I would agree with that. And then the last thing I would add is it might be a category error to say that we can get at the good through proposition.
Well,
only
this
and through this
definitely
pain. Yeah.
Wallace thought that. Definitely Wallace
Yeah.
thought that, and I think that that's. I mean, there's some stories in Brief Interviews with Hideous Men where he really dramatizes that. I think it's the boy is up on the diving board and he's trying to
Yeah.
decide whether to jump and he's going through all the logic and whatever. And I write about this, and then at some point you just have to leap, and
Yes.
basically like Wallace is trying to dramatize this sense that on many questions, and in fact, on the biggest questions of our lives, you will never be able to logic your way. It's like
Yeah.
this thing of like, should I have children? You simply cannot settle that by making a ledger of pro and con or
Right.
deriving rules from some piece of philosophical logic. You may fool yourself that you've done it, but in truth, like that's not how it works, and you are not gonna and so I mean another philosopher who I talk about a lot in the book is Stanley Cavell, who was of course a great reader of Wittgenstein. And Cavell always said the modern sort of philosophical mindset, it tricks you, or it tempts you into thinking there are only two options: certainty or skepticism. So you
Yeah.
either
Yeah.
achieve certainty, or if you can't get certainty, and he has a book called The Quest for Certainty, then you must go all the way to the other side, to
Yeah.
nihilism. There's
Right.
nothing. There's nothing of value. And I
Yeah.
think that was a trap that Wallace understood very well. And he understood
Agreed.
it at a sort of gut level as something that happened in our individual lives when we boomeranged from, say, deep depression, where literally nothing in the world felt meaningful. Um, and how do you get out of that? You try to grab onto something that gives you certainty.
Hmm.
But it's a sort of trap, because if you're looking for certainty, eventually you're not going to find it in the most
Yeah.
important things in your life, and then you're going to slide back. And so
Yeah.
there was this kind of that was something I think he dramatized extraordinarily well, even just on the personal level. But something that also has, I think, cultural significance, that we can talk about. But yeah.
Yeah. I want to talk, I'm reminded, I think it's the Keats quote about like negative capability.
Uh-huh.
And artists who have negative capability can embrace the idea that uncertainty exists. And in fact, they can be uncertain about something.
And live in the uncertainties. Yeah.
And live in it exactly. And so, and this is why, right, I was so excited to read Wittgenstein, right, and I was so excited to kind of see these counter arguments. I think coming from because I was my background was in analytic philosophy and
Yeah.
standard undergrad background, and like coming from a more analytic space, right,
Yeah.
and still sort of challenging a lot of these that dichotomy, right, that you just described, which I felt like was a false one too. I was like, dude, I'm not certain about these things, but it doesn't mean I need to be like Bishop Barclay about it. Like I'm not,
Right.
um,
That's the truth. We live
yeah,
in this we all live in this
we
uncertainty, in
all live it,
fact. And
yeah,
so having some way to live with that fact is, yeah, is
yeah,
important.
it's important. It's so valuable, and I want to actually get into a little bit about like Wallace, the individual, because you said, that this is something he modeled personally, at the very least in his fiction, but I think his personal life, it's tough, right, John? Because it's not up for debate. In this case, the author actually is dead, but he's a little bit undead in the sense that there's stuff out there to kind of talk about, pick apart a little bit. And not to do so, I think on the identity level or the reductive or maybe even disrespectful level, but I think there's something worth talking about when it comes to this concept of the abyss, Wallace's own struggles with addiction.
Sure.
Um, I'll just read this question out loud here that I have for you. You run on Substack this really great series called The Sincerity Files, which I have read with much interest. And you wrote one of these essays, you wrote about the viral Harper's Gooning essay, and you linked it to Knausgaard, Wallace, and Dostoevsky. And it was so fun. I'll link it in this at the bottom of this post too. But you you kind of this linkage, John, that you made about like staring into the abyss, right? Like looking at that kind of nihilistic nothingness, and wanting to not dwell there, but pull back and actually like recover some meaning, right? Recover some significance. You linked it to these three writers in a really cool way. You said, Wallace's formal destabilizations in his fiction, his big postmodern novel that is very self-consciously influenced by other big postmodern novels. You suggested that he wrote this way in defiance of a mediascape or televisual abyss. As we know, Wallace was admitted to an addiction to television.
Mhm.
Admitted. See, I'm sounding so moralistic. You know what I mean. Um,
The
it's the
last
same
great
kind of
American novelist that loved television.
that love
Very
television.
important.
Yeah, that's a much yes, that is an accurate way to describe it. Yeah, and not um the same kind of void that Knausgaard saw Dostoevsky as quote attempting to fill with light. Um, so I'm wondering though, in this context, how should we interpret Wallace's addictions? And I'm even pushing past because we know that he struggled with like alcohol, drugs, TV, yada yada. But I'm actually thinking of proto-gooning. So, according to D.T. Max, The Pale King was originally about a slight everyman who could perform in any porn, like any porn film, any piece of pornography. This man would wear a green suit, and you could imagine yourself to be this man, the Pale King. Of course, the book was different.
I
It's in its
totally forgot
posthumous
about that.
release.
That's funny.
Yeah, I was literally looking up, John. I was trying to figure out who first said every love story is a ghost story, and I came across that little nugget from DT Madsen, the New Yorker. I was like, oh.
Yeah.
Orton Condensa's entertainment, as well as much of his filmography, was erotic, right?
Right.
Wallace's characterizations of women do suggest a strong acquaintance with the other side of the beaded curtain at the back of the VHS store. He was an addict in many ways, but his addiction to porn is really discussed and may, according to sources close to him, have been at least partially responsible for his suicide. How should we regard the writer who urges us to think beyond the abyss despite succumbing himself to the entertainment? Was he sounding a warning, grasping at straws, or doing something else altogether? Before I turn it over to you, I just want to say, like, this question isn't so much about, oh no, he failed to live by his own example. It's flawed. He's a failure. It's a failure. It's more about, to me, there's always felt like an undercurrent of, um, to me, Wallace's like porn addiction and his sex addiction has felt like there's an affinity with that particular abyss. That this is not something that has like been talked about a lot in
Mm.
relation to him. This is something that porn addiction, right? It gets shunted, it gets politicized. Oh, that's a conservative talking point. Oh, you're sounding like Andrea Dworkin, right? Whatever. And I am bringing it up, John, because it's because it was so closely linked to his suicide, which is
Mhm.
believed to have been due to autoerotic asphyxiation, played a role in it. Um, I'm curious how you I'm curious, I guess, how you feel about like the interplay of these elements in his fiction and in his life, because there was something there that wasn't being talked about, and there was something he was pushing away with the whole like, "Get out of here, John Updike! You suck! You're a phallocrat." And I'm wondering if this is something that you have detected, and I'm wondering if it figures into the broader conversation about addiction and propositional thought for you.
So no, I mean the porn thing is not something I've thought a lot about, and I'm curious. I mean, it's interesting to think about it, and I'm curious what more you've thought about it because it sounds like you have a little bit. I think I was going to bring up the phallocrat thing. Wallace obviously wrote this essay about Updike and Roth and Mailer, the great male phallocrats who were obsessed with sex and their own penises, and it's an amazingly fun essay to read. But the obviously it's implied in the essay that Wallace is of another generation of
Yeah,
writers. He is not like them. And even to the extent that we later get this sort of picture of him as a somewhat abusive boyfriend, and we get the Wallace Bros and this kind of stuff, you never really get a picture of him as a Roth or Updike. I mean, which
no,
doesn't mean he wasn't like that. I mean, I think something that I mean, there is a way in which sexual as I just think about it now, that I think male sexual eros is never portrayed realistically in his books. It's sort of either made into a kind of cartoonish thing, which is
Mhm.
maybe connected to the pornography. He definitely, the pornified stuff, or it's sort of hyper sinister. In Brief Interviews with Hideous Men, although it's not even about the sex usually there, but there's something like really perverse. It's telling you about the guy's narcissism, usually the things he does sexually. So, I do think there was some kind of repression or at least unwillingness to deal forthrightly. And maybe it was partly in recoil from this previous generation of writers with sort of male sexuality on its own level. It's quite interesting when you think about it that there's really not a real reckoning with that. There are pornographic
Right.
fantasies of teenagers come up fairly often. But yeah, the adult male as a sexual being is really not dealt with in Wallace. Don't you think? I don't know. Not that I can think
Yeah.
of.
So I would agree. And when I look at the Phallocrats essay and I look at the time he wrote it and the time Infinite Jest was published, you had a kind of like a rising feminist consciousness with like really wild outgrowths in a lot of different directions, including the recovered memories phenomenon, the pseudoscience of recovered memories. You had the satanic ritual abuse stuff. You had this really strange in feminism reformulation of Freud that was basically like, guess what? You're going to recover a bunch of memories and you're going to understand that you were abused and you were abused by a family member and you were abused in this way and that way. Here's my best-selling book. Like, I'm gonna help you. And this is of course too, like this isn't just like Dr. Phil, right? We're talking about women who are like prominent essayists, like major like theorists and figures in the community who are kind of starting to yeah, like do this, like have these conversations that have always struck me as missing the getting at the point and then missing it. And plus the pseudoscience is there for anyone to see. Wallace at this point in time is like, I mean, how unfashionable would it be if I'm a very ambitious young man who is who does want any of them wanted to hit it big and to be famous. Like it's like if I'm Franzen, if I'm Wallace, right? I am of a generation where I could have been watching the Johnny Carson show
Yeah.
and seeing Gore Vidal have like a really cool author fight, and like seeing Norman
Yeah.
Mailer, moderate the town hall. I'm like, that was wild, and like Susan
Yeah.
Sontag, brilliant and hot, and and like I think that I think that all turning down Oprah stuff aside, right? It's reasonable to believe that these guys could have had a desire for a certain literary presence or a career that is not quite as accessible or available in the same way to writers today. And how unfashionable would it have been to be like, you know what, Norman Mailer, great guy. Like Philip Roth, like I think because I think that the way that a lot of up, Updike and Roth, especially the way that they were being recountenanced during that time, was really through this kind of like anti-phallocrat lens, and so I think that DFW cannily aligns himself, with this feminist movement, but the Katie Royf essay points out, and I thought pretty shrewdly that she has this 2009 essay called "The Naked and Conflicted," where she's talking about Wallace, Chabon, Franzen-ish,
Yeah.
a few others, and how like Eggers, like they're very there's a primness, there's like a denial of the realities of male sexuality,
Yeah.
but she suggests that this denial has caused stuff to get subterranean and
Yeah.
strange, which I know that
And
sounds Freudian itself, but I feel that
no,
it might
no,
have
I'd
been
like to
true.
read that. It's interesting. I mean, because
Yeah.
I actually think this problem has only gotten worse since then. I mean, I
Yes, I
think in
agree.
contemporary fiction, there's literally like no heterosexual sex. It's
Yes.
just like, at least not written by
Yes.
men. we
Yeah,
have Sally Rooney and but and
sure.
Garth
Well, yeah,
Greenwell who
totally.
has there where there's a lot of gay sex, but there's very little Brandon Taylor, but there's very little heterosexual sex in
Yes,
contemporary fiction. I mean, the idea
from
of
men.
and God, like the idea of Ben Lerner writing sex, it's just I don't even want to think about it. But
Yeah,
two things I would add to what you were saying. I mean, I think the cultural environment I'm sure had something to do with it. I also think there was a legitimate kind of, although there were figures like Bret Easton Ellis around this time who took
yes,
a different path.
yeah,
Um, I do think there was a kind of kill your fathers aspect to that article too. And I think
sure.
Wallace, there were sort of two strands feeding Wallace. You had the Roth Updike, sort of big macho American novelist, and then you had the DeLillo Pynchon, John
Pinch
Barth,
and yeah,
postmodern metafiction
yeah.
strand. I think at different times in his career, he went after both of them. And
As a
so
lot of his friends, contemporaries and friends did. A lot of
yeah,
men, yeah, yeah, totally.
I think he in some ways it was a little less direct, but in many ways was harsher on the metafictionists than most other people in his generation. He really saw in the end a kind of equivalent form of narcissism in metafiction and this sort of endlessly self-conscious, recursive way of writing and thinking, as he did in the more overt narcissism of the Updike Roth thing. And I always found that interesting. But
Yeah,
one other thing I would just add to the mix is, I mean, Wallace himself was I think a deeply conflicted and Christian in certain ways person. I think
yes, yes,
he probably himself, even aside from the cultural judgments, was uncomfortable with his own sexual desires. Like this,
yes,
I'm speculating here, but this would not surprise me that he would be someone that would feel a lot of shame about watching porn. He felt shame about watching TV. He felt
yeah,
shame about, all kinds of things that he did. And you see this both in his personal life and in his characters. It's dramatized many times. So I think that I think all those things probably related to why maybe if porn has this subterranean or porn addiction has this more subterranean aspect in his writing.
I mean, I see him as, and if his death is in fact, I know this is also speculation too, but if his death is in fact related to autoerotic asphyxiation, as I
What
have
do you mean by that? The speculation is that he didn't mean to kill himself, or
so the it's less it's from people who have known Wallace, there is the suggestion that that could have played a role because that was part of what was going on for him a lot,
hmm,
a lot, a lot. And I I know I too am kind of like I'm speculating here. I'm co-signing your speculations, right? But I think that there the idea that this guy was in many ways a hyperverbal canary in the coal,
mhm,
like someone who had a whole ton of shame, who had a whole ton of like father anxiety, who had a whole ton, literary father and whatever, of stuff that I think is integral to the male experience, right?
mhm,
Fear of being the whole like alpha beta thing, like, and who died and whose death was undergirded at the very least by a profound depression. We know
yeah,
that addiction can't help depression, right? In fact, the two feed each other. It feels why it feels so important to be talking about him now, so long after If the Just was published, is this hasn't gone away. This hasn't gone away. This is such a problem still. And to me, right, sitting here, the essay I wrote for the point is about detransition, and how I spent some time, quote unquote, as a millennial white man.
mhm.
Not really, but kind of,
Yes.
and my adjunct appointment in the masculinity, but from my, conversations just in the kind of like sex and gender space and the trans and detransition spaces, you name it.
Yeah.
There is a very real awareness among a lot of people that our conversation about like masculinity and the crisis in masculinity, it cannot be male supremacy, straight white men rule the world that are totally untroubled, or gooning.
Yeah.
Like this, there, like, and I think this is why I've been really excited about your sincerity files too, John, is because you're like, this is, can we a little bit sound the alarm here? Because we have essentially ground down the experience of like whole, like vast swaths of the population, men broadly, that's many people on earth, and then white men, okay, that's a huge chunk of that too, to just a set of identity characteristics that are really, really delimiting and dangerous. And for those individuals being stereotyped by them,
Mhm.
as is any identitarian conversation from any side of the political aisle, right? Like you name it, I do find it dangerous. And so when we see this from David Foster Wallace and we see what he was writing about and we see how he died, even speculation aside, right? It's just like, okay, he died by suicide. You know, I feel like I feel like it's important to know that, and I feel like you were perceptive in linking all of this to the Gooning essay.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, I talked about this in the book a bit. I mean, I think that it's totally the fact that people are very interested in Wallace as a person makes sense based on how he writes. I mean, and this is related to my point of like offering this philosophical therapy. It's a very intimate experience,
Mm-hmm.
that he's giving his readers. I think
Mm-hmm.
self-consciously so. He always wrote about he talked about fiction as a conversation between human beings, and I think that you know. So it's totally natural to ask, well, what happened to this person who's giving
Yeah.
us this advice?
What
You
happened? Yeah,
know,
totally.
and I think these are in some ways, whether you think they're the right questions or the wrong questions, they're unavoidable questions. And we also know now various things about Wallace, and we can't unknow those things. And the
Yeah.
way I always like to think about this question is sort of like you might think in theory there's something good about separating the art from the artwork or whatever, but in practice this isn't even possible. We know certain things about the artist. We bring those things with us when we read the artwork. The question
Yeah.
is when you go back to these stories and these novels, can they survive what you know about the person? And
Totally.
there are examples where there are examples where the answer is no, and that speak tells you something about the art. Um, I think in
Yeah.
Wallace's case, one of the things that was frustrating to me about the discussion about like, well, it turns out he treated women poorly, so we shouldn't read him or something, is like anyone who read him knew that. Like, what do you think?
Oh my God.
Brief Failures with Hideous Men was a book that I read when I was 23. And it
Yeah.
really, I can't actually think of a book that probably had a greater impact on my personal behavior than that book because I felt so identified by it, by the forms of narcissistic behavior toward women and possibly even toward other men and anyone in my life that intellectual men self-rationalized. And
Mm,
obviously, I knew reading this that the author of this book has some experience with these
yeah.
forms of narcissism and poor treatment. It just to me was like, so like it's not like he was hiding, it's not like he wrote as if he was a Christian saint, and and
Right.
and you could say, and the reason I bring that up is because I think you could say something similar about the depression and the suicide. I mean, no one wrote more powerfully about suicide than Wallace. I'll never forget that passage in Infinite Jest where he says, and I remember especially because I was reading it the year of 9/11, after 9/11, and he has that image where he says, when you look up at a high window, if someone is about to jump out of the window, he said it looks crazy from the ground. How could they jump out of the window? But you don't know that there's a fire behind them. And he said that's what it feels like when you have what he called psychotic depression. It's not, it's like every moment is so painful that the jumping becomes the more reasonable thing to do. And, that was, I don't know. I mean, I've always remembered that when I hear people either in my own life that commit suicide, and I guess you're supposed to say died by suicide now. And in Wallace's case too, I think about that all the time. And whether it was the porn played some part, I think he certainly. Another thing he wrote about, obviously, all the time was addiction, whether it was porn
Yes,
addiction or other kinds of addictions. And I think certainly it would not surprise me that addiction played a part in his depression and suicide, and then guilt about the addiction and this whole spiraling thing, you know.
absolutely.
And the interesting thing about the Gooning essay is those people do not present as depressed. In some way, they have found, at least within the article, I mean, I'm sure there's many different Gooning, communities, and
That
I'm
was
sure
great.
there
Yeah.
are, but within the article, one of the interesting things is the question, have they actually found a nice a community? You know?
No, John, it's true, right? He does ask that question, but I feel so having had like personal experience with addiction, and this is like the foremost thing that brought me to Wallace. The number one
Yeah,
thing
I
was
think
like,
a lot of
wow,
people.
like I have addiction issues. Not that I'm like cognizant of
The
them, right?
person
But
who
I have
first
addiction.
recommended Infinite Jest to me was someone who, even in high school, had like profound addiction issues. And yeah.
Yeah, I have addiction issues, and they are connected to the fact that I'm really doing a lot of Cartesian thought. That's
There
what
you
brought me to
go.
Wallace. That was it. And so the Gooning essay, it was hard for me to. I was like, I just don't. I understand where you could kind of stretch this and make it seem like, oh, they're having a fun orgiastic Gooning community, but this does feel to me just like pure uncut dopamine seeking.
Yeah.
And these are the behaviors that kind of are consistent with it. And I think that you know
That's fair. I
the
mean, drug addicts can have a community too, but it's
a
like, yeah.
community, totally, yeah, train spotting, totally, yes. And so I think that the like you jump out of the window. I remember that quote too, that you jump out of the window but people don't realize the room is burning behind you. This is where you get when you are not only doing so many loops of propositional thought, so many like discursive, like let me distance myself from the world, rhetorical moves, but it's also like, addiction is just slow suicide. It's just a slow suicide. Drug addiction, alcohol addiction. At least, at the very least, that was my, kind of what I witnessed, and in some aspects of, experience of it, my experience and friends' experience, just the depression, I could go on, but
Did you
the
feel, Roth, that reading Wallace, or that it did help you sort of change your thinking in some way about your own life?
yeah, and so totally. That's kind of what I was getting to. When I by when I read Wallace, I did feel hope about breaking out of the propositional phase. But the reason I asked the Gooning question is because it it's and the book doesn't need to be a perfect moralistic roadmap. I'm not asking for that, but I felt hope, but inconclusive hope. I felt like it was not a solved problem. It was not a settled case. I felt a sense of recognition. And mind you, John, I'm the kind of woman who, a lot of different people transition for a lot of different reasons. But I'm the kind of woman who transitioned because I was so sort of like disconnected from my own body
Hmm.
that I was like, I have no problem reading Infinite Jest. I'm super alienated from my body. So here's some description of Kate Gompert. That sucked, but it doesn't feel like it's about me. You know what I mean? Or like the entertainment, what a horrible description of a thing. Who cares? I'm alienated from my body.
Yeah.
Descartes. So like I was able to glide past what actually I think feels like for someone like Deidre Coyle, right, personally implicating aspects of that book. And just kind of abstractly being like, oh, that sucked. But what felt to me personally implicating wasn't how he treated women, even though I am one, and even though he treated women poorly. What felt personally implicating was the way that he was like, you can crawl out of your shell, right? We don't always have to be Hal going mute and limp and catatonic in his interview for the, University of Arizona. But can you really though? Isn't it gonna just kind of get you in the end? The truth will set you free, but not after it's had its way with you.
And
But
did you
what
feel when Wallace died that that was sort of the proof of that? That, he himself was not able to crawl out,
to crawl out? So
not
a
for good
little bit,
anyway.
but no, yeah, I know what you mean. A little bit, but I'll be real. I came to the whole shebang after he died. So it was 2011
Okay, I
when I
see.
was 21 and I first read Wallace. So it was some of that though, to be clear, but I think it was also in the writing. I think it was the fact that I don't think Don Gately's going to survive what's going on for him. I know the book is all ending on ellipses,
Yeah.
but like it's there was the I think there's something kind of integral to the text that made me feel like, oh, this is nihilism tinged. This is hope, but like it is there is something Nietzschean about it, right? Where it's like God is dead. Okay, like what are
Well,
we even doing
it's
here?
interesting. The way I think the sort of general kind of thing you're saying is that, one of and I talk about this a little bit in that Sincerity Files piece you mentioned. I mean, one of the things, so on one hand, Wallace is telling us like we've got to change our frame. We've got to get to a place where we can give ourselves peace from certain sort of questions, going back to the
Yeah,
Wittgenstein quote. There are certain sort of questions that people like me, meaning Wallace, people overeducated Americans with a certain kind of orientation toward the world are drawn to asking and drawn to getting mired in, but which are actually making us unhappy and they don't have answers. We just sort of go in the whirlpool, to go back to the Cartesian
yes,
image.
yes,
We just get stuck in the whirlpool. And we have to find a way to move beyond these questions and find a way to, or ask them when we feel like it, but also give ourselves peace from them when we need it. So you could say, but wait a second, Wallace can't stop doing that. He keeps in his books coming back to these questions. And one way I describe them in the book is as adolescent questions, by which I don't mean that
mhm,
only adolescents ask them, but almost every adolescent does ask them. And the
sure,
question is, to some degree, I think the way Wallace frames it is a sign of maturity is to get to a place where you are able to stop asking them when you want to, and you can kind of live your life as opposed to constantly calling into question every sort of decision. And so
yeah,
here's a question: did Wallace ever get there as a writer? And that's always something that has interested me a lot. I think he wanted to. I think he very self-consciously wanted to. And I think that if you look at Pale King, there are sort of tendrils going out in that direction. There's,
sure.
that story Good People that they got excerpted in the New Yorker,
Mhm.
parts of the Chris Vogel story. There's parts of the book that are, there's some part, I always felt there was some part of Wallace that wanted to just like start writing like Tolstoy finally, like write about marriage and death and
Yeah,
love and
Tolstoy era.
sex
Yes,
and war
totally.
and the
You're
great
already
topics.
Christian enough, man. Just
Yeah,
yeah,
religion. You just write about the great topics enough with the
yeah,
freaking self-consciousness and theory and postmodernism. It's like you've dealt with
yes,
that. Like, let's go, Now
yes.
it's about life. We can move out from the problems of theory to the problems of life. But he never fully got there. And that's sort of how I think of him too in his life. Like he never was able to fully get there. And
And ooh,
which
John,
doesn't
this
mean
feels
that there
yeah,
aren't enormously useful resources pointing the way within his
sure.
writing. But I agree with you that he never sort of showed the way out in the way that, in a Tolstoy novel, for instance, you will just see like, oh, I can live like this. There's nothing
Yes.
like that in Wallace.
And John, thank you for saying this because as you were speaking, this thought just popped in my head. Like, I got sober. I continued to live. My life got on a really different trajectory. It was not because of reading David Foster Wallace. It
Mhm.
was not remotely because of reading a word by David Foster Wallace. Do I still love David Foster Wallace? Yes, but in a
Was it from
different way
reading
than I did before.
anything?
Oh yeah. It was from reading
Yes.
Aldous Huxley.
Okay,
It was from
interesting.
reading The Divine Within. It was from reading, yeah, Huxley's older
So you went
essays.
towards
But
stuff that gave you an actual spiritual, like, kind of.
yeah, yeah, it's a non-propositional, spiritual. Well, reading mysticism, Hildegard von Bingen, totally. But I think that, like, you know, even pulling back from my personal experience, it's like, did Wallace get me started with that kind of um dissatisfaction with that space I was in? Totally.
Yeah.
But I think this is to pull it back to your book. You make a point, or to pull to the sincerity files rather. You make a great point about the Wallace bro, right? And how it's this 30th anniversary. Like the most we've heard about this guy in this book is that white men who suck read the book, which is it's just so uninteresting to me. I really don't care about that with that discourse. I dispense of it. But you talk about how the proliferation of the Wallace bro, or at least the Wallace bro archetype, is because, as Stanley Cavell would say, these dudes wanted something sincere and serious to believe in, just like Bernie Sanders, the Bernie bro Wallace bro overlap. I thought that was really beautifully put by you. Now, here's my thing, John. Keeping in line with what we've been talking about, right? I'm 100% on board. The fiction David Foster Wallace, gave a whole lot of young men who are turning and turning in the widening tire a lot. You know what I mean? Something sincere and serious to believe in. It did it for me. It did it for plenty of people. But if we are articulating this break, right, this gap between
Yeah.
like fretting about living and actually living, a gap that Wallace himself in life and fiction wasn't able to bridge, do you see any parallels with, for instance, where white men seem to be kind of marooned right now in the literary
Mm.
world, the Jacob Savage stuff? Like you said yourself, we have not seen heterosexual sex in a novel by a straight man, and like this feels like an important part of the equation to me. It feels like
Yeah.
something worth talking about.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, yeah, the short answer is yes. I think that those well, so to go back one stage, it's like I think the Bernie Sanders thing to some degree, or you could call it political fervor, became the thing to believe in the
Mhm.
2010s. So that this is sort of my grand theory of sincerity since Wallace is Wallace said we need something bigger to believe in. There's all this stuff in his, and he talks about the new sincerity. He never really tells you what that thing is going to be. Though there are some interesting moves in Pale King toward politics as a potential, but he's like
Mhm.
interested in people doing like tax law. It's sort of de-romanticized political work.
Yes,
Coming
and pivoted away from the original subject matter, which
yes,
was
yes,
yeah,
exactly. So sublimated maybe. So
yeah, yeah, yeah,
So I don't think he could have ever imagined. I mean, Wallace, when I first read Wallace, I'm a child of the 90s. Politics was so uncool. The idea anyone would like find sincerity in American politics was just absurd. That's we were into art, and artists were sort of the authentic heroes of the not late 90s and early 2000s. Um, Consumerism was the enemy, and you got, so Wallace. So what happens though, in the 2010s, and I think there's a lot of interesting reasons for this. It starts maybe with N+1 actually as a sort of huge early cultural indicator that we're moving in this direction. And then, you have the financial crisis, Occupy Wall Street, big events in the culture, Obama. You start to get this generation of people who really feels sort of turning away from the enemy and sort of end of history sense of the
yeah.
90s, that they can commit to politics and that
Hmm.
politics is going to deliver a sense of meaning in their lives.
Yeah,
And for various reasons, I think that didn't really work out. Now, one reason is that the left politics, the Bernie Sanders politics, didn't win. Um, I think there are probably some things we could say about politics in general that make it unsuited for you
yes,
don't really want people
agreed.
finding all their meaning in politics.
That's really tough.
That's what
Yeah,
happens in fascism and whatever. So
yes,
I think there's some reasons why politics was never gonna be satisfying in the way that some of those people wanted it to be. But you can understand why something like that or at least I can understand why something like the Sanders campaign presented itself in such a way. It was also a place to find community, to find people that cared about something like you did. And, so I think that, anyway, but that period seems to be over now. And so I think we've now returned to that place, maybe what that you're describing, where there's this sense again, and this is why I started the Sincerity Files, was like my feeling that we're something like there are important differences, but there's something similar, or there's an affinity between where we were at the end of the 20th century and where we are now, where there's a
Yeah.
deep sense that something is not satisfying, that we don't have a sense of meaning. And this, I really think, is not limited to men, even though it gets
No.
talked about,
Oh, far from
but,
it. Yeah.
very often in relation to men. But I really think this is one of those situations where the problems of men will become the problems of everyone very soon, if they haven't already.
Yes.
Men might have been a leading indicator where in the 2010s there was a little bit more of a sense that women were sort of also part of a political and cultural project that was sort of on the ascendancy. So, men felt more left out or whatever, but I think it's going to come for everybody. And there's a real, and so yeah, I think there's this real question now again, a sense of wanting something to be sincere and serious in, but what is there? You look around and it all feels so flimsy, and it's so hard to justify committing to almost any of the sort of extant institutional, political, even artistic options that are being produced by our current culture. And yeah, so then there's a lot, and that's a dangerous place to be, but also an interesting place to be.
See, yeah, and that's what I want to push back just a little bit against the idea of it being dangerous because I've seen this too in women's discourse now, as if discourse is so gender segregated. It's not, but you'll see what I mean in a second. Women's discourse around um the 2010s, and you saw, I think, we've seen kind of across the political spectrum a reckoning with like wokeness. What was it? Did women do it? Like all that jazz. And and the idea that like you have the sexual revolution and it meant certain things for a beat, and what it ended up becoming was oops, like hyper patriarchal. Women should behave like men, and the sister wife situations are great, and we're going to kind of rationalize other people's desires and humanity away, yada yada. You had another kind of excuse me. So then you had the reaction to that in the 70s, 60s and 70s being Reaganism, right? And being like, okay, at least like the trad wife experience is a more parsable one. And so now we're kind of reckoning with the second wave of quote unquote sex positivity, and where has that landed us, right? Whereas ethical non-monogamy landed us, like where has like here's my speech act and that's my gender landed us, like what does it all mean? And I hear a lot of women saying actually just what you said, like this is really scary. We're going to swing back into a new form of Reaganism. It's scary. And I actually feel only excited, and I think it's because of that negative capability that I really wanted to like cultivate maybe in myself, or at least I'm seeing a lot of the people most immediately around me. Um, what if it's not just the case that like we have to find the new long arc of the universe and where does it end? And oh my God, like what if we dispense of the Hegelianism? Not
Mhm.
entirely. Hegel had some great things to say, but if we dispense of that kind of like the obsession with the Geist. Where is history
Yeah, yeah.
going? What does it mean? What's the belief? And what if the belief is uncertainty? It's
Mhm.
so scary, but then after it's scary, it's like so much less torturous is I don't know, what I'm feeling, or maybe
Yeah,
what I'm
yeah.
wondering about. Um and this is I think back to Wallace, right? This is I think where maybe that final leap was so difficult to make, because if I were to say what was dogging this guy at the very end, I'd be like he was still searching for certainty.
Yeah, maybe. He was still searching for certainty, and yeah, I mean, I think also there was, yeah, and well, not also, I mean, this is related to what you're saying because he was very much a product of postmodernism. And there was some
Yes.
part of him, even though I think he is one of the most, I think he gave one of the deepest and most important criticisms of it, of sort of what I might think of as postmodernism as a form of life, and a form of thinking. but he also was a product of it. And I don't know that he was ever able to completely break free from yeah, like so from the quest for certainty. And this is what I mean partly by the contrast with Nausgard, who I think Nausgard's writing to me is an adult's writing. He's writing about
Mhm.
adult life. And there
Mhm.
is no, there is not the adolescent it involves neither the adolescent questions nor the adolescent answers. There
Yeah.
is not this sort of like this sort of like corrosive self-consciousness, and there is also not a sort of constant need for some theory or idea, even if it's a non-theory, that will solve those questions. That does not mean there are not problems, and of course, Nausgard, talk about shame and someone who writes and thinks a lot about shame, but he does it forthrightly, and I think he does it in a very sort of it's very much about the everyday life of an adult, someone who has children, someone who has to wake up and change diapers, someone who, is trying to balance a career with other concerns and things he has to do, and someone who thinks about death and immortality as well. I mean, he's not limited. He's not, it's not that he trivializes those things, but he shows how they appear in the course of a real human life. And
Yeah.
I think that, yeah, so I think that Wallace never quite got there, but yeah, I'm trying to just to think to go back to your question about the sort of question of danger and living in uncertainty. I think living in uncertainty can be good, but I do think, especially thinking about young people, you have to give people resources that they feel they can use to work through those questions. It doesn't mean to achieve certainty,
Absolutely.
but at
Sure.
least to reflect on them in a way that feels satisfying and gives them a sense that they're not just being sort of buffeted along in the sort of sea of social media and technology, because I've seen a lot of people that feel that's what their reality is, and they don't even seem, it's not even that they want certainty. They just want something that they can like
Mhm.
feels enriching in their lives instead of impoverishing. And one of the things you said about Hegel, it reminded me actually of an essay I was just editing, which it hasn't come out yet, so I can't get into it that much, but it's about art. It's about the future of visual art. And one of the things the
Mm.
author said that really stuck with me is he said, we need to go, he said something like, what the art world needs right now is to be able to draw on the resources of the past, but without the Hegelian progressivism narrative. Like, we need to let go
Yeah.
of the idea that what we're doing is continuing this long line of progress with everything we do. But that
Yeah.
doesn't mean letting go of the past. In fact, that
No.
means you open up the past and you try to because there are many resources there, and one of the
Yeah.
problems we have today is this kind of relentless presentism and this feeling like I can't get outside the frame of like this week, much less
Mhm.
much
Mhm.
less go back 100 years. And I think just helping people understand that, this is it comes back to my sort of humanistic side, that there is this tradition of thinking, of philosophy, of art, of religion, of theology, and goes back to my PhD, is like I found in that program all of these resources for living, that were,
Really.
for me, alongside in some ways, maybe that's my equivalent of what you were saying was Huxley.
Yeah.
Wallace showed me the dissatisfactions, but what I found in this program was a humanistic tradition that really spoke to the problems in my life and helped me navigate those things, and felt
Yes.
rich and serious and not so sort of engulfed by the present moment.
I I absolutely agree. I mean, I can't agree more, frankly. It's almost like the learning the rules in order to break them or modify them, right? Like this is why, to go back to our earlier part of this conversation, theory appeals so immensely.
Mhm.
And it's so exciting, and yeah, it does,
It
it feels
feels like
kind of
one of
like
those tools
fraternal
that
and
can help you figure it out.
totally. Yes, it does. And theoretical frameworks, in fact, are some of those tools that
Yeah.
can help you figure it out. But it is the take what you need and leave the rest thing, right? You can get way too rigid in one direction or way too rigid in the other.
One of the
You can
problems with
be,
theory,
yeah,
though, one of the I think inherent problems with the sort of ethos of theory is in its attitude toward the past, because theory
mm,
is itself quite I mean, contemptuous isn't quite the right word, but theory does not postmodern theory does not present itself as here's a view of the world that is in dialogue with the other views of the world and is
not in
going
the
to sort
least.
of be
Yeah.
one you can weigh alongside the others. It
Hmm.
presents itself as superior to the other views and as
Hmm.
encompassing them in a way that shows
Yes.
them as having only led up to theory in some way. I mean, I still
Yeah.
remember being in my freshman
Hegelian.
English class and having them explain to us how yeah, people have been doing literary criticism for a couple hundred years, but really for a long time they just kind of talked nonsense and said what they liked and didn't like. And then along came postmodern theory and culminating with at the time new historicism, and we have systematized it all, and we have like shown you like what we have shown what criticism really is. And all that other stuff is really only significant insofar as it leads here. And I think that's an enormously damaging view of like the
Yes.
past to give, especially to young people who aren't even familiar with most of that stuff. And so that's just one caveat of like the problem of theory is that like I think yeah, you should take what you need, but there's a tendency for that germ to kind of infect like your ability to then see the value in other parts of the tradition.
Oh, absolutely. Like there's it's almost like an intellectual messianism, right? Where
Yeah,
it's
for
it's like
sure.
there was the darkness and now look, there's postmodernism, there's new historicism. And I think that I personally am so glad that I read so much Hannah Arendt before I even dove into the some of the deeper waters of postmodernism because I write a lot in the essay I wrote for the point. I talk about how I wrestled with like Judith Butler, who's a noted Hegelian,
Yeah.
but you wouldn't know it from I think some of what's being taught there. But like it's a noted someone who began right with interpretations of Hegel, and said, hey, our like in the Hegelian sense, the roles that we play in the world don't need to be so rigidly prescribed. We can have a more humorous relationship with them. We could joke about it. We could be playful about it.
Yeah.
And he went from that to, I think, what I see as a more doctrinaire position vis-a-vis gender roles, ironically. Um, and I'm so glad that I read on totalitarianism and I learned when Arendt talks about the kind of the imposition of the imagination on the polis, right? Where it's like,
Mhm.
okay, I'm going to like impose my idea of how things are and how they should be, and probably most dangerously, right? Most destabilizing, how they were in the past.
Yeah.
So now you've got to retcon everything. That is, I mean, that's the germination of fascism is right there. And that I think is like what can be hard for the left to recognize, what can be hard for the lawless reader to recognize is like this idea that, oh my God, there is the architecture of dogma and power seeking in what I thought this whole time was a critique of power and what I thought this whole time was a belief system
Right,
that
right,
was going
right,
to
right.
help and guide me. Holy shit. How did that
Right.
go?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's well said.
I thank you. And I want to close this out, John, with this last question about editing the point. This is a journal that has been around. You guys have been around since like 2009,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Yeah.
yeah, which is
Most people are
wonderful.
shocked when they hear that because I feel like for the first like 7 or 8 years, no one had ever heard of us, but which is rare actually. Usually journals are most popular at the beginning, but somehow, I don't know. Yeah.
The arc of the point bends toward
Yes.
popularity, the J curve. So yeah, you all the stuff we're talking about, right? In I think like we could make it about our generation. We could say like millennial collective consciousness, but there's been a lot of just broader cultural shifts that have impacted people in different ways, and impacted people who are thinking about art and
Yeah.
writing, and and you as editor of the point and your co-editors have really seen these things happen, like these movements, and seen people's thought change.
Yeah.
And it's really kind of awesome in our conversation about this one writer, David Foster Wallace. Like we've touched on so many different
Yeah.
yeah, temporal and cultural eras. Can you maybe share with me, like, and of course our viewership, um, what what you see moving forward after the vibe shift, right? After this kind of collective reckoning with identity politics and a lot of the stuff that, Wallace was trying to sound the alarm about, and many other writers as well. What do you kind of see coming down the pipeline? What are people writing, and what are you excited about? Maybe let's put it that
Man, that's $1 million question. I fear preliminarily that my answer will be unsatisfying, but I think that the role that politics played in the 2010s as the sort of concept where everything was sort of so much of intellectual life revolved around how you responded to certain kinds of political questions. My hunch is that we're entering a period where that's gonna be true of technology.
way. Interesting.
I think that, and by technology, I mean, not only AI, but how we think of the lives we lead online. Um, for my students at NYU, and I've tried to assign a lot of essays, including the Gooning one about this, because one of the real challenges for them is how do you write journalistically or intellectually about life online? Now,
Mhm,
you could say, well, why should we do that? It's boring. But the truth is, that's not a sufficient response anymore. Too
mhm,
much of our lives take place online. And in fact, there's a real challenge of how to make our lives offline meaningful these days. I
mhm,
think like there's this sense we all have, and this also actually came from something I was working on. Someone had this paragraph, a writer, about like, what do we do with those moments that we can't post online now? We all think, I mean, whether it's hard to admit, it's shameful to admit, but I think we all think about this now. When something happens in our lives, how does it relate to my online, and of course, when I say we all, I'm, want to be careful. Obviously, like I'm talking about people in our general demographic and
mhm.
education level. It's still not, you
Sure.
still will find parts of America where people are not online all the time, though not that many of them. And, they may be
Mhm,
on different platforms, or they may be playing video games, or they may be playing, but I think that, yeah, I guess I just think, and I think for young people, there's such a feeling of feeling trapped in a sort of algorithmic culture and rhythm of life. And what to do about that really is like often the central question of their lives. And it ramifies in all these different areas, whether it's, intellectual life, how do I think about AI and my own development as a writer, whether it's dating. We just published this
mhm,
essay, Doomers in Love, in the most recent issue
mhm,
by Mana Afsari, which talks about the role of sort of digital culture, digital siloed culture and apps on Gen Z dating,
mhm,
whether it's how I participate in politics and the role of hyper politics and sort of that being mostly an online phenomenon. Um, I just think all these questions right now run through the screens,
yeah,
and obviously for me as a teacher and an editor, there's questions that are very personal in that too. How do I adjust how I'm teaching and pedagogically and um, so I think, yeah, I don't know. I guess that's the most substantive thing I have to say. That I feel that that's the thing that's really coming down the pipeline. And someone we've been asking this question of liberalism and a good life, the good life. What is the good life today? What does it mean? I think this, first of all, I think that's a question a lot is back in the minds of a lot of young people.
yeah,
And it's very much related to them to the tech stuff. Um, but one of the answers I always that sort of rattles around in my mind is like a good life is maybe a human life. Like we're actually in a period where to say that is actually controversial, that like there are going to
yeah,
need to be those of us who stand up for living a human life.
yeah.
There are very powerful people out there who don't put much store in the idea of a human life. And again, talk about something where there's the humanistic tradition will be important to draw from
Mm,
and to think through as we try to protect that idea of the human life in relation to this technological period we're entering. That's something I'm thinking a lot about.
Wow, absolutely. I mean, yeah, that makes so much sense. And this is something that it was, of course, presaged by not just Wallace, but writers before him. It's really, cool is maybe a misnomer because it does feel frightening to have such screen mediated lives. But what feels exciting to me is how younger and younger writers and thinkers are like grappling with it, and
Yeah.
how, yeah, what does it mean to live a, to return to the human life, to live a human life? If I may throw my hat in there, I don't edit the point, but if I throw my
Yeah,
hat in the
no,
ring a
please
little bit
do. I'd
here,
be very curious what you would say.
I would actually, I would add a cosign that because I had seen some similar like anxieties and interests in my students at SIU when I was teaching there. But then also, what's most exciting to me right now, especially in light of what you've just said, John, is the idea that we have like rethinking the notion of a lapse. If we're talking about like how all these different belief systems and ways of interpreting history and interpreting the present are predicated upon a kind of like Christianizing morality, right? It's like, well, we lapsed, what will save us? Well,
Hmm.
we've lapsed, what will save, and it's like there's a way of reading the like screen addiction, phone addiction, we're all online is we've lapsed, or the billionaires have lapsed, or they allowed us to lapse. They were evil, and
Hmm.
we like bit the fruit, and now we look at the
Hmm.
phone. And
Yeah.
and I think the idea that we like a non-lapsarian concept of the present and of history really
Yeah.
excites me. Because
Yeah.
like I think we people get to a really nihilistic place of like I'm online a lot. This feels shitty.
Yeah.
And what you're saying is actually the hope not tinged with nihilism, is the like maybe this is pushing us towards something even more exciting. Maybe this isn't just all grindingly bad. And
Yeah. No,
that's
and I
where I
mean,
would
I don't think it's all grindingly bad, and I think there's, that's why it's like I think as a, in term, and also it's like part of the role of running a magazine, like the point, or at least for me, is like you have to stay interested in what's going on.
yes.
I mean, I always say like no literary magazine can survive without some like quite passionate readers in their 20s. Like you have to
Hmm.
have those people. And you have to,
Yeah,
but it's actually not hard for me because I am interested in these things. And I think like there obviously can be a kind of response to all this of like you said, like let's just get off the phones. Well, like that's not really like it's not realistic, but it's also kind of it's blind to all the ways in which like digital life does like create meaning for people now.
yeah,
And I think we have to really like sit with that and think about it. And the Gunner's essay, I liked, I think one of the reasons it really resonated with people is like he was trying to do that to some extent.
totally.
There's a Barrett Swanson essay about the TikTok houses from a few years
Yeah,
ago that I also read with my students that's like interested in this. These kind of things. It's like, how are people making meaning in their lives through this? And I think we as intellectuals and writers and stuff have to engage with this stuff. Doesn't mean you have to, you can't criticize it or you can't like try and understand how it could be better or be engaged with in a better way. But I think like it's stuff we've gotta engage with. And like you said, the Gen Z writers in some ways are better at it. I mean, unlike us, they have grown up with it from day one, and they, I think,
hmm,
are more articulate and more aware than anyone about the ways it makes them unhappy.
yes.
And so they are, for them, it's their native language, and they need to figure out, need to have places where they can explore those feelings and how to move forward, I think.
Oh, John, I couldn't agree more. It makes me feel like, we've gotten to adulthood, they will too. It's not just going to be an endless game of eschaton. Thank
We'll
you
see.
so much. This is a wonderful conversation. Those of you who have not checked this out, checked out John's book or his writings on the Sincerity Files, please do.
I'll
Please
say just
subscribe to the point.
the title
Yes.
of Ordinary Unhappiness comes from the great Freud quote. that the
It
job of
does.
psychoanalysis is to return us from what is it, something hysteria to ordinary
To
unhappiness.
ordinary. Yeah, because and
And that's a
I love that
task
you
for
put
our
that in
time
there.
as well.
I love that you, yeah, because it's not just like everything is bad and shitty. It's bearing down on me. It's like, how am I participating in the concept that things are bad and shitty? What if things are really great? Let's try it. So yeah, who knew that we could get that from Freud? But of course we can. We can get it from anywhere. John, thank you so much. I'll stop this recording. I'll talk with you a bit afterwards. But this formal conversation has been so great.
It was my pleasure, Ralph. It was a lot of fun.